Cutting boards. Cutting boards are almost like a rite of passage for woodworkers. So whether you're just starting out or you've been building for a while, cutting boards are something that you can and definitely should build. They are super easy to build, of course. You can go step by step. You can make it really simple. You can make it slightly complicated, more complicated, many different steps. There are so many ways of making them. And they make absolutely beautiful gifts as well. So today I'm going to show you how to make 3 cutting boards. We're going to use mostly walnut because it's just so gorgeous. And we're going to make a really simple cutting board. We're going to make a cutting board with mixed woods. We're going to add a little bit of color. And then we're going to add a little bit of sparkle. So I can't wait for you to see all 3 of these cutting boards. But before we get started, if you are new here, I am Annika and I am here to demystify DIY and inspire and empower you to build all of the amazing things. Now let's get started. So let's start with this walnut board. It's about 8 inches wide and I am going to cut it off at about 16 inches. Essentially, I'm trying to avoid that big knot that is in there. But of course, you can pick whatever width or height you want for your cutting board. Now I did run it through the planer, which is totally optional. If you have an S3S or S4S, you can probably skip this step. I just wanted to make sure that everything was flat. Now for the corners, I am using a corner routing template and I will be using a flush trim bit. However, this exact thing can be achieved using a round lid to draw out the corner and a jigsaw to cut it out. And actually, I'm going to be doing exactly that on the 3rd cutting board that I make. So watch for that. But if you do have a trim router, this is an easy way to get that perfect rounded corner on all corners of the cutting board. At this point, I decided to give the top of the cutting board a little bit of a shape, which I freehanded, but you can buy templates online if you want to trace them as well. I cut out the shape using a jigsaw, and you do want to make sure you use a top and bottom cut blade because that's going to give you a good cut finish on both sides of the board. At the top, I added a hole with a 1-inch Forstner bit for hanging up the cutting board. And at this point, I realized that I probably wanted to make the top a little bit narrower. So I redrew the shape I wanted and cut that out with the jigsaw. I decided to use my trim router with a round over bit to give all the edges of that cutting board a nice rounded finish. I did this on both sides of the cutting board as well as on the inside of the hole that I cut out. This step is optional, but I think it gives it a nice professional finish. At this point, I filled any voids and cracks with a CA glue and sprayed it with the accelerator and got down to sanding. I started sanding with 120 grit and then went down step by step to 180 and then 220 grit. I am using these foam sanding pads and I have everything linked in the description below. But I like these because I can sand the edges without altering the shape, which can happen with regular sanders. To sand the inside of the hole, I used a rotary tool with a drum sanding attachment. And now it is time for water popping. Water popping makes the fibers in the wood swell and stand up. And this only happens once in the life of the wood. So once you sand this smooth and apply a finish, next time when you wash the cutting board, it's not going to absorb the moisture. So once the water is all dried up, you'll feel that the cutting board is a little fuzzy and we can sand it down using fine grit sandpaper followed by extra fine grit. Once the entire cutting board is sanded smooth, it's time to wipe it up and apply the finish. I am using a food safe finish, which is a blend of mineral oil and beeswax, and I have it linked in the description below. Once I applied it, I let it absorb for about 20 minutes, came back, wiped off the excess and applied another coat. And I repeated the entire process of letting it absorb and then wiped it off. And once the finish is cured, which in my case is about 7 days, we're done. That is the first cutting board. It is super simple. It's basically just a piece of walnut that has been shaped and finished beautifully. Now it's time for the second cutting board where I'm using a few boards of walnut, some mahogany, and some maple I have left over from previous projects. I'm going to set up my table saw to cut all of these boards down to 1-inch wide strips. And this 1 inch is going to actually be the thickness of the cutting board. I'm using mostly walnut, but then I did cut down 2 strips of mahogany and 2 strips of maple. I basically got enough strips to make a cutting board that is about 10 inches wide. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of, we have walnut, we have mahogany. I've got 3 strips of mahogany, I've got 2 strips of maple, and now we can just play around with this and sort of create a pattern that works for us. Now what a lot of people do is usually they'll arrange it something like this. So we got walnut, then we got a strip of mahogany, and then we have maple on both sides. So let's take this out. And now you have this pattern where you have walnut, lighter wood here, and much lighter wood here. So you've got this cutting board with a stripe in the middle. It's very popular. Maybe even take one of this out and just make a single stripe there. You can play with it as you like. Also, you can see that there is a color variation in the walnut as well. So you can move it around until you are happy with the colors, the way they look. But what I am going to do actually is I am going to go with sort of an ombre look to the cutting board. So we're gonna have the lighter wood over here. We got the lighter wood, then we got the brownish tinge. Now these 2 maples are more brown than the rest of them. So we're gonna move that over, and that is sort of what I'm going for. Okay, now it's time to set up the clamps and set up all of these boards for the glue up. Now I am using food safe waterproof wood glue, and that is extremely important in cases like this. You want to apply a good, generous amount of wood glue. I can't stress this enough. Over apply the wood glue. You want to make sure all of the boards are perfectly glued together. I clamped all of the boards together nice and tight and wiped off as much of the excess glue as I could, because this is going to save us time later. And to make sure that all of these boards stayed even and flat as they were gluing up, I clamped a piece of plywood on top of them. But I did cover the plywood in packing tape, which is going to keep the plywood from gluing itself to the cutting board. So next day, now that the glue has dried, it is time to take it out of the clamps. I used a rasp to scrape away as much of the glue squeeze out as possible. And I also used my sander with an 80 grit sandpaper to sand away as much of the glue residue as possible before sending it through the planer. It took about 3 passes on each side through the planer to get a nice uniform board. I filled any visible voids and cracks with CA glue and sanded that down. And now it is time to trim the board down on the miter saw. I only had about 18 inches of maple, so that's going to be the dimension of my final cutting board. But I also got this little baby board with walnut and mahogany, which I will do something with in the future. I used my trim router and a chamfer bit to chamfer all edges of the cutting board to give it that beautiful, professional, sleek look. I sanded the whole board down to 220 grit, sprayed water to pop the grain, and let it dry, and sanded it again to 220 grit and 320 grit. And then after cleaning up all the dust, it was time for the final finish, which I applied, let it absorb, wiped it off, and applied a second coat. Once it's cured, it's ready to use or gift away. I really love the 3-tone look with the light brown from the mahogany and the white from the maple. It's going to make the perfect addition to my kitchen. Okay, now cutting board number 3. For this one, I'm using S3S walnut, so I had to trim off one of the edges. I'm using an 8-inch wide board cut at 16 inches. I filled the voids and cracks with CA glue, and now it's time to give the board a shape. For the corners on this one, I actually used a masking tape to draw the round edges, and I used a jigsaw to cut it out. And then I sanded the entire board down to about 180 grit. Now here I am not using a sponge sanding pad, so you want to be really careful around the edges. So you're just softening the edges and not changing them drastically. Now for the inlay, I am using these brass rods that are all different diameters. I found drill bit sizes that matched the brass rod diameters and made holes in the board to about half the thickness of the board. I kind of eyeballed it, but if you're not comfortable doing that, you can use a masking tape on the bit to judge the depth. The brass rod should fit pretty snugly in there. I went ahead and made a whole bunch of holes of various sizes all across the board. I just kind of went with a really random pattern, but you can also map out the pattern before you start making the holes if you like. I mixed up a small batch of food-safe epoxy and added that into the hole and pushed the brass rod into the hole. And then I used an oscillating tool with a metal blade to cut off the excess rod. You do have to be careful to keep the blade parallel to the surface of the board so you don't damage the walnut. Once all the brass rods were in and the epoxy was cured, it was time to clean up the board and sand it down. I started with 80 grit and went on to 120 grit because there was a lot of epoxy mixed in with the brass dust, which was pretty rough. Now it's time for some water popping, followed by some sanding, and then the final finish. And here it is. To be honest, when I came up with the idea, I wasn't sure how this was going to turn out, but it turned out better than I had imagined. And here are the 3 boards we made. There you have it, friends. Super simple, easy, and gorgeous cutting boards that you can build in one weekend. They make absolutely wonderful gifts, or they just add a beautiful warmth to any kitchen. I have a bunch of DIY gift ideas coming to you in the next few weeks, so definitely stay tuned, and if you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.